Step into a world where determination defied odds. In 1903, a small shop's humble beginnings birthed the most iconic name in watch fashion. But how did a German orphan rise to craft a legacy synonymous with excellence? This is the tale of Hans Wilsdorf, transforming watchmaking into a global empire. From Kulmbach to Swiss horology, his story is one of resilience and innovation. Join us as we delve into Hans's extraordinary journey from adversity to triumph and witness how he turned a simple idea into an enduring legacy. Welcome to the remarkable story of Rolex. Hans Wilsdorf was born in 1881 in Kulmbach, Germany, the heart of Bavaria. His hometown is known for its famous bratwurst, but Hans would one day be known for something very different. His mother died when he was very young. By the time he was 12, his father also tragically passed away. This left Hans and his siblings in the care of their uncles. Their family owned an iron tools company, which was operated by Hans's father at the time of his passing. The company had been started by Hans's grandfather many years before. His uncles made the very difficult decision to sell their father's legacy to ensure the proper care of Hans and his siblings. The uncles were very loving. Hans wrote in his autobiography that they instilled in him a sense of self-reliance and independence. They knew that life would be difficult now that his parents were gone, and they did everything they could to teach him the strength and skills to stand on his own. To do this, they knew that they needed to give their nephew the very best education possible. If the family legacy was being sold to pay for their upbringing, the children would need the know-how to forge their own paths. The money they made from selling the family business was spent entirely on the care of the children. And so Hans and his brother and sister were afforded the opportunity to attend prestigious boarding schools. Hans found great success learning foreign languages. His love of language and learning inspired him to travel all over Europe in his younger years. His travels led him to become an apprentice for an international pearl exporting business. It was during his travels that he fell in love with the quaint villages of Switzerland. Hans would travel all over Europe and the world later in life, but his heart would always be in Switzerland. In 1900, he left the pearl industry and entered into a career in Swiss watchmaking. La Chaux-de-Fonds, a city in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, was the home of over 15 watchmaking companies by this time and competed with Geneva itself for the right to be known as the home of the famous Swiss-style watch. Hans had a special place in his heart for everything Swiss. He loved the towns, the country, the way of life, and the people. So, naturally, he became instantly infatuated with the mathematical precision of their watches. Hans had also shown a great affinity for mathematics when he was in school. The math and calculations behind building a reliable watch intrigued him. Initially, he worked for watchmaker Kuno Korten as a clerk and an English correspondent, since he was fluent in multiple languages. Over time, however, his responsibilities were expanded to include winding watches and ensuring their accuracy. This proved to be the most influential job of his young life, as this straightforward job was where he learned about all the ins and outs of how a watch should work. He learned about the many styles of watches and what made them different. And during those early years of his career, he began thinking about what he would do differently if, one day, he was the designer. In 1903, Hans moved to London to continue furthering his career. Within 2 years of the move, he was able to save up enough money to start his own watchmaking company with his business partner, Alfred Davis. The Willsdorf and Davis watchmaking company began with lofty goals. They intended to create high-quality timepieces with a modest price tag. Hans loved the high-end feel of a good watch, but he was still very aware of his roots. He wanted to bring high society quality to the average customer. The Rolex brand was born in 1908, filed and registered in Switzerland by the Willsdorf and Davis Watch Company. Little did they know that this product line would soon go on to overshadow the Willsdorf and Davis names. Years later, Hans recalled the process of coming up with the Rolex name. They had struggled for weeks, generating hundreds of names that just didn't quite fit. Then, one day, the name struck him. It was one morning when I was sitting on the upper level of a double-decker powered at the time by horses, driving along Cheapside in London, that a good genie whispered in my ear, Rolex. A few days after this fruitful journey, the Rolex brand was filed and then officially registered in Switzerland by Willsdorf and Davis. Hans was dedicated to making the Rolex name synonymous with reliability. He wanted his watches to have the same reputation as his uncle's: reliable, precise, and true. The mission of Rolex was to be the name people thought of when they thought about timepieces, and the world began to notice almost immediately. In 1910, a Rolex was the first wristwatch in the world to receive the Swiss Certificate of Chronometric Precision from the official watch rating center in Bienne. This was a major triumph for Hans, as wristwatches were not yet accepted by the masses. At the time, the most common type of watch was the pocket watch. Wristwatches were known as wristlets and were not considered very manly. Pocket watches were considered the more elegant, masculine way of keeping time. Hans, however, was a visionary. He saw the benefits of wristwatches and set his sights on changing everyone's minds. In 1914, he wrote, "My personal opinion is that pocket watches will almost completely disappear and those wristwatches will replace them definitively. I am not mistaken in this opinion, and you will see that I'm right." If you are enjoying this video, make sure you tap the like button. That tells YouTube that you want to see more content like this and helps us bring you more videos about your favorite brands. Now, back to the fascinating story of Rolex. World War I broke out in 1914. This was surprisingly a turning point in the world of watchmaking. During World War I, Rolex developed trench watches, since pocket watches were not practical in battle. Trench watches were basically wristwatches, but not as flashy as previous designs. They had a simple strap and face so that a soldier could use their watch to tell time and direction without fumbling around in a pocket first. It was during this time that the idea of wearing a wristwatch was seen differently. Before, it was almost seen as a bracelet. Now, however, since the manliest of men were wearing them in the heat of battle, public opinion started to shift. And just like that, Hans was proven right. The future of watches was on the wrist. In 1919, after the war was over, Hans relocated the company from London to Geneva. After 16 years in England, the siren song of his first love could not be ignored. It was time to move back to Switzerland. Over the next decade, Hans would spend nearly all his time perfecting a waterproof and dust-proof watch. He had noticed that dust and water could creep into modern watches and would disrupt or damage the device. He labored tirelessly, a man on fire, for several years on the project. Then, in 1927, he felt he had a design he could be proud of, and Rolex launched the Oyster. Hans recognized just how game-changing the Oyster was. It needed a different style of marketing. His instincts told him the Oyster needed a different audience than his other timepieces. This watch needed to be everywhere. He was previously implementing exclusive deals with those who could carry the Rolex brand, but he needed something new. As always, Hans was ahead of his time as he began the hunt for a brand ambassador. Over the next several years, he would land not just one, but two. A swimmer named Mercedes Gleitz and the land speed king himself, Sir Malcolm Campbell. Gleitz would showcase the waterproof nature of the watch, and Campbell would distinguish its precise reliability. The first major stunt to be performed with the Oyster was when Mercedes used her watch while swimming across the English Channel. She wore the watch throughout the entire exercise. People hedged their bets. Would the watch survive the trip? The swim took 10 hours, and the world held its breath as they watched the feat. When she came out of the water, the watch was in perfect working order, and Rolex had a reputable brand ambassador and an exciting story to tell for decades to come. Now that he had captured the eyes of the world, Hans knew he needed to capitalize on the publicity. He was never one to rest on his laurels after success. Hans believed in maintaining momentum, and continued pursuit of success was better than waiting for it to come to him. Rolex began investing in further innovation to fuel the wristwatch craze. They spent the next 4 years perfecting their next major design, and in 1931, Rolex developed the perpetual rotor. This eliminated the need to wind one's watch, as the device would utilize the wearer's motion to keep the watch wound naturally. This self-winding mechanism was the first of its kind, and it helped keep Rolex on top during tumultuous times in the global market. When World War II broke out, it was expected sales of things like watches might dip, considering more funds were being saved for the war effort. However, for Hans and Rolex, that was not the case. By the start of the war, Royal Air Force pilots were buying Rolex watches to replace standard-issue watches, which were found to be inferior. The watches had such a reputation that captured pilots would have their watches confiscated by Axis soldiers. When Hans heard this, his heart went out to the prisoners of war. He offered to personally oversee the replacement of each and every confiscated watch if the pilot would only write him a letter explaining their situation. Over and over again, Hans proved that he never forgot where he came from. He always had people in mind, and he remained grounded throughout his lifetime. He had a particular soft spot in his heart for children. He and his wife were unable to have any children of their own, so after she passed away, he created the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. The foundation was created to help bring up children in similar situations to the one young Hans found himself in at 12 years old. He wished to replicate the kindness and care his uncles had shown him and his siblings all those years ago. However, the scope of the foundation quickly grew, and charities and social causes all over Geneva found themselves being funded directly by Rolex. In 1960, he would hand over control of the company to the foundation, on the condition that the foundation would continue to donate a large portion of their earnings each year to charity and social causes. To this day, the foundation continues to hand out scholarships, honoring Hans's wishes that children be afforded the opportunity for a good education, regardless of their circumstances. Outside of his philanthropic endeavors, Hans loved sports and adventures. With the Rolex brand well established, he sent watches into all sorts of situations he called living laboratories. He would send watches to mountain climbers, divers, swimmers, and bikers. He sent watches to sportsmen, hunters, and fishermen. Any circumstance in which he could study how the watch was being used and how it held up to the user's needs, he was interested. Rolex began developing watches specifically for aviators, mountain climbers, race car drivers, and divers. In fact, in 1953, Rolex released the Submariner, which quickly became the go-to diver's watch. Sadly, Hans died in 1960. He's buried in Geneva, so he will always be able to hear the ticking of his watch factory. Rolex continues to abide by his philanthropic wishes, donating a reported 90% of their profit to charity and social work while still developing new and exciting timepieces. Today, the company is worth $8.8 billion yearly. In a system where many step on the backs of others to lift themselves, Rolex stands as a shining example of how to build a successful empire. Hans always lifted others up, relying on his merit and his work ethic to carry him to new heights. With that example, Rolex continues to reach new heights today, over 100 years after the company's humble beginnings. The 12-year-old orphan from Germany could never have dreamed this would be his amazing legacy. What do you think was Hans's greatest achievement? Let us know in the comments. If you like this video, you should check out our channel and subscribe. We have loads of other videos for you to enjoy, so head on over. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.